Your Royal Highness, Prince Hassan bin Talal of Jordan, Your Excellency, the Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, professors, His Excellency the Ambassador of Jordan, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for ISPI, the Italian Institute for International Political Studies that I happen to chair, to host this dialogue in such a key issue, on such a key issue in international relations as interreligious dialogue and collaboration in this kind of field as a tool to promote dialogue and peace in the world. I must say that this is quite a traditional topic for ISPI. We are partnering with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with the University of Sussex. We have a program that is exactly aimed to promote dialogue, to encourage dialogue. It is called Religions and International Relations Program. It is the 10th anniversary this year of this program, and we are glad to have here also Professors Petito and Melloni that are actually, Professor Petito in particular is the head of international religious relations in ISPI, while Professor Melloni is a big part of this kind of topics also in Italian and international press. I must say that I feel a little bit puzzled and a little bit odd as an analyst because we always assume that we live in a secular age. And then suddenly we discover that we debate about religions, and not exactly about religions from a theological point of view, but about religions as a factor in international relations. And maybe this is also due to migrations, to increasing flows of population as spin-off of globalization. Maybe it is also due to a sort of a renewal, revamping of religious extremism, especially, unfortunately, in the Islamic world. In any case, we are here more often than seldom. We find ourselves to debate about the relation between religion and politics, international politics, more often than seldom, as I was saying, as a factor of conflict than as a factor of peace. And from an analytical point of view, this is something that is striking, I must say, given that we live in the 21st century, after all. But the analytical point of view is maybe not enough. That is, a think tank. It's not just about ideas. It's not just about analysis. A think tank is first and foremost something like an intermediate group. That is, I know that intermediate organizations are no longer in fashion and seem to be less in fashion than they used to. But nevertheless, since we are deeply convinced that intermediate organizations still have a role, the role here for an institute like ISPI is to offer platforms of dialogue, to try to offer occasions and to smart organize, if you allow me to say so, to smart organize occasions to share opinions, to promote opinions, to confront ideas, and actually to enable the governments to make their decisions on a more aware and informed basis of possibilities of consensus. It is not up to the institutes to find practical basis of compromise. It's up to governments. But without the intermediate organizations, governments are maybe less profound in their critical analysis, in their strategic analysis, and so this is what we are here for. And another striking thing here is how this whole range of topics can be inserted into a world in which international law is still underdeveloped and in which international community is still sort of a primitive community. What are the most effective tools here to try to rule the international community, especially in a phase in which multilateralism and the ambition to govern the world seems rapidly fading away, giving place to nationalism, an individual way of developing international affairs of individual countries? Well, I think that there is still something that is there and that can be effective, the power of indignation of the international community. And when we speak about religious factors, a religious dialogue, the power of indignation of the international community still has a powerful role to play, according to my humble opinion. And this means that each and every attempt of promoting such kind of dialogue should start from the ambition of promoting a whole-world mobilization. A mobilization of civil society, a mobilization of press, a mobilization of the world of academia, a mobilization of international organizations, a mobilization of key figures in the international community like His Royal Highness, for instance. And this is with this ambition that we are struggling to deal about those kind of arguments, and this is the main, I think, ambition of a program like the one that ISPI is trying to promote. So I would really, with warmly thanking him for having given us the opportunity to be here, I would warmly invite His Royal Highness to take the floor. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to go straight into dialogue as soon as possible. I'm not here to give a 20-minute speech, a 20-minute monologue on the need for dialogue. I would rather suggest that the topic is so important to all of us, and I want to say that fostering interreligious dialogue is not a disembodied exercise. We're talking about human dignity, about millions of people who are more important than all of us in the context that we're trying to address, struggling to establish their identity and to practice their cultural and human rights. I want to point out, if I may, that Jordan has been struggling with the headwinds of regional war and the consequences of war from 1967 through 1956 through 1970 to 73 to 1980 to 1990 to 2000, and then of course 2011, the beginning of the ongoing violence in Syria. So I want to suggest to you maybe that we look at the Levant region and ask ourselves, is it possible for any of these individual countries to solve the basic problems, the basic dilemma of carrying capacity? A country like Jordan, which was approximately 3 million people in the 1990s, is now 10.4 million people. So when we speak about the needs and wants of people, it is interesting to note that Bretton Woods, the IMF and the World Bank are now talking not only about taming the budget, but they're talking about the needs and wants. What do people want? What do they need? And that means 50 nationalities in Jordan today. It means 5.2 million Syrian refugees in the Levant region, 5.2 million Palestinians, and 5.2 million Jordanian population. Somehow the symmetry of this figure is easy to remember. But in terms of the ongoing crisis of human dignity, I want to make it very clear that the absence of a clear policy of enabling and empowering for citizenship is a very difficult reality that we have to cope with. Although all of these people, or most of these people, nationals or refugees, migrants or internal migrants, are Arabs. It's very easy to refer over the Arabs, but there's so many stereotypes of Arabs, and I don't want to go into those stereotypes. But nobody actually looks at the Arabs as human beings, as I did when in one evening 500,000 people left Mosul, largely Christians, to be assimilated in the hospitality initially of all our churches. We have 14 churches, 14 confessions of the Eastern Communion, and mosques. In fact, interacting with such an invasion of humanity was one of the most inspiring things that I have been able to do in long, long years. Yes, in the 1967 war, I was building refugee camps. And I asked the then Minister of Interior, why are we building a refugee camp on an aquifer? And the minister said, well, this is temporary. And I said, well, how temporary is temporary? And here we are, decades later. But that experience was a quantitative experience. This experience was more of a qualitative experience. When we talk about Yazidis, when we talk about Kurds, when we talk about Arabs, Christian, Muslim, Sunni, Shia, one is talking to the continuous feeling that there is some kind of an underlying reason for misunderstanding, rather than promoting a reason for identifying and highlighting the shared values that these people represent. The experiential component of this is so important to what I would call a culture of intimacy. There's a lot of networking going on for internet, but I would like to speak about the networking of internet. And in that sense, I just want to say inner peace, inner justice cannot be achieved unless the human dignity is addressed in the context of a multi-dimensional human deprivation index. We're not talking here about the basic requirements of water and food, education and health and habitat alone. We're talking about the additional requirements of responding to feelings of exclusion. It's all very well to go and provide assistance, but how long can you say to people, well, you cannot move into the market because the regulations have not yet been developed with the government or with the governments, as we talk about trade agreements, for example, with the European Union, how to partner the new manpower with the requirements of new industry and investment. These are people, ladies and gentlemen, they are not statistics. And I think that humanizing the statistics is the major challenge that good governance has faced. In fact, I think that the reason for the outbreaks of violence and even for the wars in our region is more often than not the fact that people are taken for granted. And therefore, a so-called popular movement is generally a movement over the past decades that has turned to the use of religion against religion, to say, well, here we sit as equals listening to a sermon, we sit on the floor, and when we exit this place of worship, we have to avoid ghettoization. That is to say, we have to avoid going only to those who believe the way we believe, those who speak the way we speak. But ghettoization, I think, is a state of mind. And basically what we're saying to the different groupings, stick together for your passports to be attended to, for your papers to be addressed, and so forth. And the very fact that the Christian population of Iraq goes through Jordan and other countries to end up in Europe is not considered terribly important somehow, because bureaucracy does not have a sense of the soul of a nation. I would like just to compare the Mashriq region. We are 79 million people if we take the Arab Mashriq region, that is to say Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Germany is 85 million people. We received 4 times our population, à peu près. And in Germany, 1 million refugees, migrants, create a problem. And why is that? And how can it be addressed? They have a weighting algorithm. So every migrant is a credit or a debit to the GDP, because in terms of the detailed knowledge of this migrant, it can be understood that this is the new blood that the aging German population could or should include. Of course, if it is not acceptable in Germany, then other countries with equally competent human resource development models in Scandinavia or in Canada. I forgot my medicine this morning and I forgot my glasses. So I'm glad that I was able to do without the glasses up to a point. But, now I know what I'm talking about. But acknowledging dialogue within and between faith traditions, intra and interfaith dialogue, I think you might agree with me, is acknowledging the importance of intra-independence. Not interdependence, because I don't want crumbs from the table of the other. I want mutual respect to develop as the result of this intra-independent relationship. We respect each other, stronger or weaker, as in the Benelux example, and on that basis, we commit ourselves to regional commons, national commons, local commons, wherever it is possible to arrive on a scale of 10 on an agreement on certain points, and in particular on the subject of human dignity, and then we develop creative commons together. One of the greatest examples of creativity post-war that I know of is the Sea of Constance, where Switzerland, Austria, Germany, even tiny Liechtenstein border this body of water, and the people, the population of 300 towns own the water. They are the stakeholders. In our part of the world, it's always, well, the oil-producing countries in their munificence, their magnificence, are endowing a project here or a project there. The Israelis, with their technological wizardry, are endowing a project here or there. Projects without a vision are not going to bring stability. They're going to bring returns on investment. But I'm not here to talk about risk and returns of investment. I'm talking about a flagging population which is more likely to turn to greater bitterness and extremism simply because it has not been heard. You hear the statement, "Ash-Sha'b yurid," the people want. Well, I'm trying to suggest that it's about time we understood what they want and what they need, and at least meet them in terms of recognizing that our society is not an arborescent society with the peak of it, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, remote from an extremely talented, largely young population. So I would suggest that challenging stereotypes, demystifying, if you will, accepting complexity, minority versus majority concerns, managing conflict, local, regional, national, and international, starts with an understanding of the other. It is a tradition of Western think tanks to develop conversations in other parts of the world. I would hope that we can develop them in collaboration, in partnership. So it's a two-way exercise. You have an authentic view coming from the region. I mean, you may think that I am remote, but you haven't seen me sitting in the refugee camps or with the people in the street, and they turn to me and they say, "Uncle, where are you? We haven't seen you in a long time. What's going to happen?" And I doubt my own credibility when I try to talk of hope, because I believe in hope. But on the other hand, they feel that this is a source of hope to identify these issues, even if very little is being done to manage conflict. I'm not entirely sure that managing conflict is what we want to talk about. I think that local, regional, national, and international conflict can be addressed, conflicting ideas can be addressed if we talk about cogence, wisdom, sapience. In media, you have the infosphere, you have the terror sphere, you have all forms of soundbite, clickbait, but I want to ask myself, when is it possible to talk about a regional knowledge base? And I was suggesting to our hosts here at ISPI, is it possible to talk about a regional observatorio for the Levant region, to understand what is happening in the Levant region as a result of these conversations? Researching into educational programs, that is to say, existing educational programs, I think is essential, particularly as the voracious media requires a script. So may I suggest that some of you may not know the following. The director at the Center for Global Development, Mark Plant, following a long career at the IMF, says, with the usual diplomacy of the IMF, Jordan is now hosting over 650,000 Syrian refugees, with some estimating the total number, including unregistered persons, closer to double that. Some estimating. Even with international assistance, the cost of providing refuge to so many people has strained the budget of the Jordanian government. Now, these are refugees, they're just statistics. It's not a question of stabilizing through human dignity at this stage. At the same time, international partners, notably the IMF, have been insisting that Jordan take actions to bring down government debt to more sustainable levels through increasing fiscal discipline to tame government deficits. These dual imperatives by the international community, host more refugees and tame the budget, seem to put Jordan in an untenable situation as long as the refugee crisis continues. Something will have to give. The question is how, what, and when. Guy Verhofstadt, former Belgian Prime Minister, referred to the Brexitization of European politics. He considers that Brexit has triggered a full-blown crisis and an identity war in Britain. Concerns about migration and unemployment mean that mainstream parties must adapt to voters' frustrations and the new polarization of European politics. The twin issues of what refugees need and want, as well as addressing concerns as migration and unemployment, have similarly led to frustrations and new polarization of politics in host countries within the Mashriq. 1994, Shimon Peres and myself, after the Casablanca MENA conference, Middle East, North Africa, went to Brussels and suggested a package of $35 billion for 24 countries, from Morocco to Turkey inclusive, and with particular reference to West African countries, to encourage the will of migrants to stay by providing the basic HEW package, health, education, welfare package. The answer of Manolo Marin, I recall at the time, the Commissioner for the Mediterranean, was first come, first serve. And I said, we're not here on a shopping list. We're here on a vision quest. Can you help us within a few short months to develop a vision of how to stabilize the Mashriq region? I think that it might be worth mentioning that the political economy of reconstruction, stabilizing the Mashriq, is what is envisaged before the guns are silenced. The guns are not yet silenced. In fact, the winds of war are quite fierce at the present time. We all look to the Warsaw meeting and hope that this will not be a crucial, decisive meeting in terms of yet another war in the Middle East. But all I know is that institutionally, there is no Economic and Social Council for the Middle East. The summit meeting, the economic summit meeting in Beirut only a couple of days ago, was not attended by a single head of state. When I tried to address the Arab Economic Summit in 1980, my late brother said, well, would you like to brief them? We had presented an Arab economic strategy at the inauguration of the Arab Thought Forum, which I chair. One of the heads of state said, well, I really can't manage after lunch because that's my siesta time. So I suggested, well, we have been in centuries of siesta. Does half an hour really make that much difference? Anyway, Donald O'Brien recently referred to the European project as a peace process. What are you Europeans going to do about it? The great merit of the European community as it has emerged is to sublimate identity-based conflicts, not to suppress them, to sublimate them. The European project is basically a peace process with a common market, a customs union, and associated institutions attached. Identity-based tensions exist all over Europe. Belgium has effectively federalized itself, and I continue to quote, the Czechs and the Slovaks agreed to separate. Tensions still exist in South Tyrol, a German-speaking part of Italy. Over 1 million Hungarians live in Romania. Identity tensions led to violence in Northern Ireland, Spain, the Balkans, Ukraine, and so on. The European project is still work in progress. Sustaining peace in Europe since the Second World War was not easy nor simple, even under a US-led security regime. That same figure, ladies and gentlemen, $35 billion, was what was spent to create homeland security. So it seems to be easier to spend money on keeping people out than it is on recognizing that our problem is your problem. 100 years after Versailles, after Sykes-Picot, we need to say enough to bilateral state relations alone. My darling country is country X, my darling country is country Y, and start to look at the bigger picture. The Arab core of the Mashriq region, as I mentioned, plus Turkey, Iran, and the Kurds. And of course, as far as our Israeli friends are concerned, Shimon Peres once said to me, I am surrounded by enemies. And I said to him, you think you have a problem? I'm surrounded by friends. When will Israel decide? Is it going to be Israel and the region, Israel in the region, Greater Israel, or global Israel? This question has yet to be answered. But I cannot yet, at this moment, underemphasize the importance of the creation of a Mashriq, a Levant Citizens Assembly. Maybe your invitations, our getting to know each other in this context, might help in developing more than a gas community. I understand we're now tied with Italy, Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, Israel, by gas. Well, if gas can bring us together, maybe a little bit of cogens, a little bit of sapiens can bring us together in what, after all, used to be the Provincia Arabia Romana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prince, for some very interesting remarks. And I'd like to kick off to get our conversation and dialogue on. I was particularly struck very much from, what I understand in some way is unavoidable. Everybody starts from his own location. And so I think it's important to understand that your thinking is really, and your reflection rooted in the difficult moment that the region, beautiful region from which you are coming, is going through. And what strikes me is that it's true that too often we think that the scenario of instability and problems the Levant, the Middle East is going through seems, and the media strengthen this view, to have to do with this renewed centrality of religion in global politics. Of course, the Islamic State and the situation in Syria and Iraq, but also many would point to the growing tension between Shia and Sunni as a destructive force in Middle Eastern geopolitics. And of course, this is interconnected with the relationship with the northern shore of the Mediterranean and the growing feeling of these oppositional narratives, which features us as Western Christian and them as Arab Muslims. So, too often we think actually religion is part of the problem. Well, after long research and engagement, we are starting to see that, of course, there are problems, but we need a diplomatic shift of mind and actually start to see that many of the religious tradition and actors want to be part of the solutions to many of these very problems that you started from. And this solution requires also thinking creatively among collaborations among different religious traditions and new forms of partnership among governments, international organizations. And I just want to give you a couple of examples, small examples, which show that this is not idealistic thinking, it's pragmatic solutions. One idea in the context of the Mediterranean policy comes from example from an Italian initiatives. Here we are hosted by the Italian Ministers of Foreign Affairs, and a very interesting collaboration that the Italian government had with a number of religious-based organizations, ecumenical, Catholic and Protestant, in launching this idea of humanitarian corridor, which was a pilot and allowed to bring, avoiding the terrible journey of death, some few thousand refugees from the Syrian conflict, vulnerable ones, children, to Italy, and facilitate the integration, mostly 80% of Muslims from the region, refugees, in our communities. What a beautiful, practical way of seeing that actually government, religious organization on the ground can work for the common good. Another interesting example, this doesn't get to the media because, when there are the crises, that get to the media. When crises are avoided, they don't get to the media. But I can remember very vividly when some of the streams of terrorist attack were very high in France, that the last one that could have really activated a very pernicious and dangerous dynamics was the brutal killing of the Father Hamel, the Catholic priest, very ancient man, a good man of a provincial area of France, which was killed while celebrating Mass by one of these radical terrorists. Of course, that then we found out know anything about Islam and never been religious, which is very often the case with this sort of profile. At that point, we were on the verge that there could be very serious retaliations. Because France is a country laïque, but it's deeply also, in many parts of it, still a Catholic country. And it was there, and it was the interreligious reaction on the ground of religious leaders, priests, and Muslim leaders, imam, which actually have good relationship, that said, let's, in a couple of days, they reconvene all in the main celebration of Catholic, the Mass, together, showing to the country that this was not an opposition about the Muslim community and the French citizens, and that they are, and that was a very powerful symbolic gesture, and the situation moved on. A situation that I argue could have actually escalated because, extremists there are in France, in the Catholic communities, and they could have retaliated as they have done in the past. So this is for me the signs that actually we can find a way in which religions can be part of the solution to some of these problems. Religions do not need to be seen just as the perpetrators of violence or the victims, by the way. And if we enlarge the picture, I want to say this very clearly, the great victims of violence and of the right to exercise religions freely today are very much the Muslim population in places like Myanmar, in the Xinjiang region of China. So, this is important to hear because, we too often associate this sort of violation with Muslim-majority countries, but some of the worst ones now are actually happening to our very Muslim friends in places where they are treated in indescribably terrible ways. But we can really think about new way of partnering, an interreligious coalition, interfaith collaboration, I think, has a role to play. It's a new area. Governments need to learn how to relate to this. Religious actors need to learn how to collaborate with government and action. But I think it has some potential. And, we talked very much about partnership with business, which is important, civil society, but in many parts of the world where these problems are, the very fabric of civil society is also about religion. So we cannot factor this out. We need to engage and think creatively about this form of partnership. And then, for example, one thing that I would like to ask the Prince has to do with this issue of citizenship, which I think you're very right, is the great challenge also in part of your work. Do you think, and some of it has to do with the fact that we need to think about new forms of universal citizenship can manage the cultural and religious diversity of the countries in the Middle East, in the Levant regions. Do you think, what kind of initiatives also religious actors, interreligious kind of platform can have to help to move this issue of citizenship forward? Would be, for example, a question I'll be interested in here. But I really want to conclude by saying that I completely agree with your point about the centrality of human dignity. Ambassador Massolo said we, the international community, need to express the indignation for some of the problems we face. Well, the word indignation has in its very root the word dignity. And I think that, is over and over again religious traditions, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, traditional religion that have this common ideal of human dignity, and perhaps from there we can hope to build a better future, all together. Thank you. And I would like also to invite, perhaps, Prince, before you can have the option to reply, Professor Melloni for some comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you to ISPI. Thank you to you, Your Royal Highness, for this opportunity. We have shared in the past years with the Royal Institute for Interfaith Studies a very important moment for us and for our research center. We worked on the topic of the Imago Dei, on the reforming religion, lately on Moses in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition. And so it is a very nice opportunity for me to develop this long-term friendship with some comments or some words that I've kept from your address. The first, of course, is dignity and human dignity. In 1486, a young Italian boy, a very rich one, made a devastating choice to invest his patrimony to summon a council of Jewish, Christian, and Muslims. And he thought that he, the young Prince Pico della Mirandola, was asked to open this council with a great address, the Oratio de Dignitate Hominum. And this marking text that was thought in a very different cultural context as written this word human dignity in our culture as a possibility in which religions, as you said, Your Highness, are not simply asked to receive, but also to produce instruments for respecting dignity. I keep another word for the introduction of Ambassador Massolo, that is the word platform. To work on human dignity, to treat and recover from this great social form of Alzheimer that makes us forget our past, that make us incapable to see the treasury that we live on, can be treated if there are good platforms at work. ISPI with MED is offering an extraordinary platform for all the people, for the diplomats, and for scholars. That means that it's not a safe place, and also for politicians to discuss and to debate. And I think that if we want to work on the idea of human dignity in a proper way, platforms are needed. Diplomatic and political platform like MED, and also other platform. I'm one of those who thinks that if we don't put knowledge in this debate, we will remain in a very dangerous level of vague and sometimes illiterated argument. Third word that I take is the word dialogue. Dialogue is a very complicated word because it can be used. It's like the autoritas in the medieval treaties. Autoritates habet nasum utroque versu possut versi. And the same is for dialogue. You can turn it on one side, on the other. You can use it to say, well, of course, now that the dialogue is over, we can wage war. And you can use it the other way. Now that the war is over, we can wage dialogue. But dialogue needs a common capacity to understand words. There is something that Your Royal Highness have certainly noticed. In the religious illiteracy that is affecting this country and this continent, we are using very dangerous shortcuts. Never in this country has, as you know, a long story of red terrorism. And we never called the Red Brigades radical Marxists. Nobody thought to call the Red Brigades radical Marxists because we had the sense that the problem was not radicalism, but the problem was terrorism. And if we want to work on dialogue, we have to be careful in order to clean the words from the shortcuts coming from this aspect. And in this sense, what you said about the sapientia is very important. As you know, Your Highness, in Italian, sapientia is sapere. That has the same root of the Latin word. It means at the same time to taste and to know. And we need to taste and to smell and to know much more that we need for this. 4 points, humanization that you mentioned. That is an essential point. One of the most important aspects of humanization, I think, is to humanize and to give a proper human face to the people suffering, to the people in despair, to the people distressed by hunger, by violence, by whatever may destroy the human dignity. But we have also to understand that religions plays a great role if we understand them as, so to say, a human phenomenon, calling the human responsibility in using them. So sometimes in interreligious dialogue, there is a point in which religious leaders are used to say that people using religion for violent purposes are not the true believers. That always remains to me the sentence, true lions are vegetarians. Religions are in the hands of the human being. It's up to the people to use it for peace or to use it for bad things. And in history, I'm an historian, we can offer to you millions of examples of people deriving from the religious experience, the reason to be wise and peaceful, and people coming from the same family, religious family, to doing exactly the opposite. And so, inside the time that we are living in, that is a time in which we are experiencing a religious climate change that is producing a religious global warming, that is producing a religious danger, devastating countries and areas of the continent, to return to this human aspect of the point is, in my view, very important, a great contribution that you gave to us. Last point, from dialogue to partnership and the proposal that you made of the observatory on the Levant. As a foundation for religious studies, as the European Academy of Religion, we started a few years ago a program concerning an atlas on religious minorities. That is a very interesting instrument. There is a great expert in this union, Fabrice Balanche, who is doing this in a very careful way. And an atlas of religious minority will teach to everybody that everybody is a minority somewhere. Everybody is a minority somewhere. On this sense, the Holy See, and I think that His Excellency will tell us something on that, the Holy See is very used to do this, to think diplomacy, thinking that there is a place in which you are a majority and a place in which you are a minority. You know, in 1953, commenting not far from here, the concordate between the Holy See and the Franco regime in Spain, Cardinal Ottaviani said that the Catholic Church will ask for the confessional state where the Catholic Church is a majority, and for religious freedom where the Catholic Church is a minority. Because he said, of course, you cannot compare truth and error. And a few years after, 10 years after, another ecclesiastical person, John the 23rd, signed the Pacem in Terris, an encyclical, by the way, stating the rights to migrate for everybody. And in Pacem in Terris, there is a sentence saying that rights pertain not to the truth, but to the people. And this changed forever, hopefully forever, the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, and it said to us that what you said about humanization is also part of this proposal, very interesting and very effective, that you made to us this morning. Thank you, Your Highness.
Your Highness, there has been a lot put on the table. Could I ask you to start responding to some of these.
I should have said that coming from Florence, I am imbued with the spirit of Giorgio La Pira, unity and diversity. So if we are going to address the topics that you have raised, I just would suggest that you ask yourselves, and we ask ourselves, 40 years of dialogue, in my case at least, insignificant as I am, can we begin with commonality? And I think that the commonality that we seek is the commonality of human dignity, whether in faith traditions, whether in interfaith traditions, or in secular traditions. Where do we really stand in terms of, one of you mentioned, I think, one of you, the distinguished gentleman, mentioned international law is still underdeveloped. Well, I would say yes, that because there is no law of peace. Everything that we have done since Solferino and the founding of the Red Cross is concessions from the law of war. But there is no such a thing as a law of peace. And this is why I think that civil law and canonic law and Sharia law maybe should be considered in terms, some form of an analogy. In fact, we are aware of the enormously important initiative taken by then Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, by Rabbi René Sirat, when together in Geneva we had the opportunity of talking about an analytical concordance of values. And as with the analytical concordance of the Bible, I think this is a subject that should be taken seriously by doctoral research in Tantur, for example, at the Ecumenical Center in the Holy Land, which looks to such development. I'm happy to say that a new center associated with Al-Quds University in Jerusalem is also going to focus on postdoctoral studies in terms of our shared heritage of history on the one side and thought on the other. So I think that emphasizing the association between theology and practicality, starting with commonality, taking into account the Enlightenment tradition on the one side and the Illumination tradition on the other. Don't forget that the sun rises in the east, and the tradition of illumination is a tradition of the wisdom of Asia, whether Buddhist, Confucian, Hindu, or for that matter, the three monotheistic faiths. The impact of such an encuentro surely would not be missed, particularly if it emphasized the principle of no coercion. Can we not uphold within this search for a law of peace the right of the other to proclaim his or her own religion? And please don't forget that the other may be yourself. When we say everyone's a minority somewhere, can we not reconsider the content of education? Yes, we can and must. Education, not matriculation. In every aspect, ensure a free flow of information. Buenos Aires, 1970s, we had an international conference on technology between developing countries. We wanted to establish databases. Data 20 years later become informatics. Informatics 20 years later becomes, what do they call it? Digital. And although we talk about knowledge bases, we do not have a knowledge base. And this is why the Observatorio is so important. But most importantly, maybe, can we look courageously and afresh at firstly our own, and secondly each other's text, heritage, and history? Can we develop a framework for disagreement? Can we accept responsibility for our words and actions at all levels? And last but not least, can we recognize the policy, the social policy dimensions of interfaith dialogue? So these are maybe some practical suggestions I would make. And your emphasis on human dignity, once again, I would just like to relate a story. You mentioned the Catholic priest and the assassination. I just wanted to say this, that tragedy reminds me of calling on Cardinal Lustiger in Paris to condole him for the killing of the monks of Tiberin in Algeria. And he, being a convert from Judaism, I think was very puzzled. Why is this Muslim coming to condole me for the murder of monks by Muslims or so-called Muslims in Algeria? And the basic common denominator is human dignity. So an atrocity anywhere is an affront to human dignity everywhere.
Very, Prince, because I think you're spot on, we need to move from the theological high-level dialogue to practicalities. What is your assessment of a very important initiative like the Marrakesh Declarations, which brought all these Muslim scholars and jurists and articulated an Islamic theological justification for the respect of religious and beliefs, minorities, and their protection? How can we make this become then concrete in citizenship right, for example? What is the next step you think that we need to do?
Well, I would like to point out that in the 1970s, and 1980s to be specific, 28 nationalities, including Italian, French, Simone Veil, Aurelio Peccei, Robert McNamara at the time, came together to call for an international humanitarian order. Léopold Sédar Senghor said humaniste, and I said humanitaire because humanist might be understood as laïque, which means in the ears of others, agnostic or whatever it may be. So anyway, what is humanitarianism about? Man against man, which is what we're talking about largely. War, and there are over 40 wars in the world today, and over 80% of the refugees are Muslim. So when we talk about corrective measures, isn't it time that Muslims felt the call to establish a zakat foundation yesterday, bearing in mind that the conditions of zakat have nothing to do with being exclusively Muslim. They are support of humanity as a result of 8 different conditions, most prominently the wanderers, as we talk about refugees in all their different categories. You mentioned quite rightly the Marrakesh Declaration of 2016, talking about predominantly Muslim majority countries and the rights of religious minorities. I would like to talk about 1925, when Faisal I, my great uncle, created the Constitution of Iraq, where it was a pluralist constitution from the very beginning. I mean, you can't even talk about Christian rights in terms of the Northwest African countries. They can't imagine a Christian Arab. Whereas you can talk about Jewish rights because of the post-colonial experiences. But in terms of ethnic religion, as it has become, Arab is associated with Muslim and Arab is associated with extremism. I have to tell you a stupid story. Some years ago, a Swiss lady said to me, "Are you really an Arab Muslim?" I said, "Well, you know, if anything, I'm an Arab Muslim." But why the sense of embarrassment in your voice? She said, "Because you're normal." So I sometimes describe myself as maybe radically normal, I don't know. But I just want to suggest that look at the number of conferences. You have Religions for Peace, the Abu Dhabi statement, 13th of December 2014. Interfaith Education on Intercultural Citizenship Program, Adian, Lebanon, Marrakesh, Baghdad Declaration. There's even an interfaith peace platform in the Central African Republic. So I would like to say, as moderator for the World Conference on Religions and Peace, we had to go from East Timor to Sierra Leone. And the basic was we would sit with the religious leaders and say, how can we promote what you call conversazione? You serve the people and we are at your service. And the basic answer was, what is conversation? It's as though the limb that has atrophied is the ability to articulate. It's not an arm or a leg, it's the ability to speak to the other. And that is not just a question of freedom of speech. It's a question of a long tradition that has been disrupted, undermined, largely by totalitarian regimes.
And I'm going, to do something because we are having this conversation. What if we encourage some brief engagement with the floor? We are Italian, I'm the first one. We do long speeches, but we don't have time. So I really would like to engage, because there are so many people with relevant experience, and we have this great opportunity to engage with the Prince. I'd like to take at least 3 short interventions so that the Prince can reply. The gentleman over there is a microphone in the room. Then the gentleman here. And any ladies, because the dialogue needs to be inclusive. I'd rather really have the lady here. Okay. So the gentleman. Please keep the question or remark short. The gentleman over there was the, yes, over there, yes.
Thank you. My name is Enrico Molinaro. I'm the representative of the Annalyn Foundation in Italy. So humbly, I should say I'm a colleague of the Prince because he's a prestigious institute. He's leading the Annalyn Foundation in Jordan. And I would like to come back to our exchange of letters 20 years ago, when you were a source of inspiration that I believe is still relevant today. Despite all these new disasters of the forced immigration, 2 ideas are still possible solutions for some of the problems. One was the idea to create a document on which religious communities and religious representatives would agree, like a status quo. At that time it was about Jerusalem, but it could be extended to the Mediterranean area. The second is about a new idea of sovereignty. You remember we spoke about the sovereignty on the holy places, because this could be also a contribution on your part about practical solutions to this identity dilemma between state identity and religious identity. So I would be happy to hear your voice if this is still relevant today. Thank you.
I answered just very quickly, and to say that in terms of the document, I think that it's the observatory that should assess what is happening and what has been happening in the last few years, and then come out with the points of convergence and divergence. And as far as practical suggestions in changing attitudes, I would suggest that the practical way to do it is to ensure school worship is not solely exclusive. I would suggest that organizing exchange programs is one of the very important factors. I was so happy to see in Cervantes in Madrid a meeting of women of the Mediterranean, inclusive of all, exclusive of none. I wonder whether establishing an interfaith week is something worth considering. I've always been impressed by the interfaith ethos of Saint Egidio, the soup kitchen, for example. I wonder whether examining teacher training curricula is also a practical example. Developing programs for the media and training for the media, linking with relevant bodies I've mentioned in the context of the observatory, but I think establishing an interfaith foundation award for good practice is something that may well be considered, which is not too academic, too scholarly, but is basically activist in terms of changing the way we see things and building a knowledge base, like we keep saying, database of what is already in existence to see this through. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman over there and then the ladies.
Thank you. Your Royal Highness.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Gianfranco Giorgolo. I'm a former Italian ambassador to Amman. And in that sense, I feel obliged, but I do with great pleasure, to recall one conversation with Seti. And after a conference where you invited me, and the subject was Islam in the Far East in the 17th and 18th century. On that occasion, His Royal Highness pointed to me an article of Corriere della Sera in which it was written that half of the Italian population is afraid by Muslim invasion. And my answer of 6 representatives from Arab countries, an Israeli, was that I was one of those Italians who were afraid by the Arab and Muslim invasion, but if the Hashemite would invade us, I would be the first to open the doors of Italy. This, of course, I still remember, and I still hope, but unfortunately there are some difficulties in doing it. On the other side, a sign of gratitude, Her Royal Highness, for having pointed out that people are not listened by governments in some parts of the world, and unfortunately it is also the case in Europe in these days. And finally, I would think that not only government doesn't listen to people, but my point of view is that still, especially in the Western world, and on this I would like your opinion, we are people who are governing and thinking with prejudice, and that while talking to other civilization, they still think with their minds and their prejudice and their values, if they have any. Thank you.
The ladies over there, and then you can... Yes.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Marica Nobile. I'm in charge of institutional and international relations for Trevi Group, that is a construction company. But I was previously an academic, and I was dealing with inter-religion dialogue and multiculturalism. Regarding His Highness' suggestions to start looking for analogies between canonic laws, Sharia, and civil law, I was thinking about the principle of reciprocity that is at the very base of every monotheistic religion, but also it is at the base of many philosophical models of civil society. I was thinking about John Rawls, but he's just one of the philosophers who deals with such an issue. Maybe this can be one of the starting points for dialogue.
Thank you. Like to...
Immanuel Kant introduced the concept of actuality conditions or preconditions, shurut al-imkan in Arabic. The purpose of learning how the human mind functions and what makes it think the way it does and how knowledge or thoughts are produced by the human mind's activity, thus shifting from imposing or examining the norms of right and wrong thinking, or evaluating judgments as right or wrong. We have this feeling that Muslims should be held to account as anybody else. Accountability should be discussed. So what is right and what is wrong? This only is a product, I think, of a culture of intimacy. After we have done what Michel Foucault called for, the study on the archaeology of knowledge. Because I think that you find periods of history in all our histories which are abhorrent to human consideration, and other periods which are actually the basis or the beginning of rational or critically rational or moderate behavior. So I would add to the bodies of law to which I referred, international human rights law. So at least you are talking in a language which is understood regionally on both, and then talking interregionally and intra-regionally. We have so many people studying in each other's countries, and so many people have studied in Italy, but what is the quantum experience in terms of ethics, in terms of the message that they may have developed? And as far as the process of healing and reconciliation, Ambassador, I think it's by its very nature not visibly dramatic. But we have a choice. Either we continue to focus on every tragedy, but not on the good hard work that is done to avoid repetition of tragedies. And this is why crisis prevention in time is so important. Thank you.
I think the conversation is going so well that I can see many hands, and also in the panel. I think I'd like to give the floor for a 45 seconds point made by Ambassador Massolo and then Professor Melloni.
44. Today is the end of the week for Christian unity. And the dream of peace among Christians, who made them capable to be less dangerous in the world, was a great dream of the 20th century. And with the very great failure now is a reality. And when you mentioned Giorgio La Pira, I thought that this too must to be and should be one of the purposes of our future, not only the interreligious dialogue, but also the infra-religious dialogue. And as Your Highness know, we have opened beside the Bologna Library, that is one of the largest in the world for the history of Christianity, a library in Palermo dedicated to the doctrines and history of Islam, dedicated to Giorgio La Pira, where the books of the different traditions and languages and doctrines of Islam may live together. And this is part, I think, of the prophecy that you're bringing to us today, mentioning Giorgio La Pira here.
Very impressive.
Well, thank you very much. I'm a little bit worried, I must say, about your curve of attention, because usually after 1 hour it is fading inevitably. So just one quick word before begging His Excellency Monsignor Guixot to make the conclusion speech. Dignity, education, self-restraint by governments. This all brings to sort of a new humanism. That is, we are back again after 1 hour to the central essence of what moves the international relations. That is l'uomo, la persona, the human being. Bottom-up approach. I was actually the first in my introductory remarks to speak about a whole world mobilization of all the components of worldwide society. But then we have the governments, we have the international relations, and we have to get them move, because at the end of the day we can mobilize, but without without acts and concrete acts by the governments, nothing or little happens. And what we have here as civil society, we have moral suasion, we have indignation, And this is why I want to introduce the conclusion remarks by His Excellency, the Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, because la persona is the base on which usually the Holy See develops its way of acting in international affairs. And we can hardly imagine another international institution with such a great moral suasion power as the Pope and the Holy See, and I mean, this kind of international presence, both religious, political, state, and secular, all this together. So what is, as an ideal conclusion for our works, what is your point of view, Excellency?
Thank you. Your Royal Highness, Prince Hassan bin Talal, Ambassador Massolo, President of ISPI, Dr. Petito, and Professor Melloni. Let me first of all offer my sincere thanks to His Royal Highness Prince Hassan bin Talal for all that he has offered us this morning, enriching our understanding and widening our vision of our topic, dialogue and collaboration. His personal reflections resonate with actual experience and thus are key, particularly in our ongoing process in building and efforts in building peace. I also thank Dr. Melloni, Dr. Petito, together with Ambassador Massolo for their contribution elaborating the view of our theme through lived experience. I think that this is for us all like a fresh air in the world in which we are living. Because if I just simply, by focusing on small headings of what we have been sharing, to hear about the necessity of platforms of dialogue, to serve humanity, to promote human dignity, to promote citizenship for all, humanizing our societies, working for healing and for reconciliation, promoting a spirit and a culture of inclusivism so loved by our Pope Francis, promoting intra and interreligious dialogue to establish this conversation we need to work for the common good, for common citizenship, promoting interreligious literacy in order to promote this sapienza, to have this mutual knowledge, seeking for equality, because there are no majorities nor minorities, but there are human persons, and we are all being created by only God the unique. So this is fresh air in our troubled times in which we are living. But I would like to conclude our discussions with a few thoughts on collaboration as a form of dialogue, particularly relevant to our globalized society today. Permit me to greet in a special way an old friend. Given the long history of our relationship, we can point to many milestones marking our shared journey of interreligious dialogue, beginning with the Royal Academy for Islamic Civilization Research, and today the Royal Institute for Interfaith Studies. His Royal Highness Prince Hassan bin Talal has been instrumental over the years in fostering these relationships, for which we at the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue at the Vatican express esteem and gratitude. May our friendship continue for many more years. Before yesterday meeting with an ambassador, he mentioned Your Royal Highness, and he told me that His Royal Highness, he is Ra'i min Ro'at as-Salam. He is a shepherd from among the shepherds who are promoting peace in the world today. With humility, I would like to remark this, because I told him, the ambassador, tomorrow I'm going to meet with him to participate in this major and important event. So, what important is to share and to open conversation, to fostering interreligious dialogue and collaboration as a new frontier of peace building and foreign policy. It speaks of both greater incorporation of works for the common good, as well as a kind of dialogue which recognizes common points as both guidelines and a code of conduct inspired by our respective religious beliefs. Surely it is of our human nature, whether believing in God or not, to respect human life, recognizing the dignity and rights of every human person, including the right to freedom of conscience and of religion. This includes, of course, ensuring that everyone has what is necessary for a secure, a dignified life, such as clean water, food, shelter, health care, education, sane environment, etc. Pope Francis frequently brings to our awareness that the homeless, the immigrants, the refugees, the poor, the victims of human trafficking, the oppressed, and the persecuted also have the same rights. A culture of indifference does not offend only its victims, but also those who look at the other side. Our religious traditions teach that our lives cannot be limited to only praying and performing rites, but must be expressed as well in our good works. وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, do good works. It is here when we really have to struggle together. When we include acts of collaboration through actual works, interreligious dialogue can make a greater impact also on our daily lives, thus becoming that new frontier of peace building and foreign policy as indicated in the theme given to today's meeting. There is an Arabic proverb which says, Al-insan adu ma yajhal. A person becomes an enemy of what he or she ignores. Thus, ignorance of the other results in suspicion, fear, and often, in some cases, in conflict. So there can be also a voluntary distortion of a religion or of its beliefs and believers. This all generates, among other problems, religious-related phobias, such as anti-Semitism, Christianophobia, and Islamophobia. And the choice to pursue mutual knowledge one of the other together is first of all an enrichment and favors friendships and collaboration, at the same time helping to prevent crisis and conflict and actually contributing to their solution. Seen through this lens, we realize that we cannot leave our needy brothers and sisters through a cruel fate over which they have no control. If our world lacks a fraternal relationship based on mutual caring, it can become for all a less secure place in which to live. Injustice breeds violence and conflict, as seen in our present world, where the gap between the rich and the poor is so large. So let us be convinced that in attending to our brothers and sisters in their needs and contributing to their development and prosperity, it will also contribute to establishing a safer and a more peaceful world. Collaboration among believers, including where possible women and men of goodwill without any particular religious affiliation, has a twofold focus: to heal the wounds of humanity, as mentioned above, and to work for the peace and the prosperity of every human person, community, peoples of our entire world. Everywhere, anybody, anytime. Dialogue and collaboration can become a goal for foreign policy as well. While the Catholic Church advocates in its social teaching a clear separation between religion and politics, nevertheless, this does not mean withdrawing from the social role religion has, thereby effectively reducing citizens who believe to mere worshippers. No, the ideal relation between the two domains of politics and religion is a distinction that avoids reducing these important areas of civil action and worship to be one and the same, but rather places them in complement. At the same time, such clear distinction paved the way for collaboration, allowing those coming from either sector to work together for the common good. No one need feel that he or she must choose between being a citizen or being a believer. Rather, we carry the dual aspect of our personhood, to be at the same time a citizen and a believer, a concept expressed often by our late Cardinal Jean-Louis Thoran, whom I am so pleased to call to mind today in this whole conference. In this context, it is with hope that we note the growing recognition by governments and politicians of the beneficial role of religions and the contribution of their followers, resulting in a mutual collaboration for the benefit of all society. Let me conclude by saying, as believers, we need to keep hope alive in our hearts and in our communities, never ignoring the problems we face and the challenges to which we are called to respond. I thank you for your kind attention, invoking on us all abundant divine blessings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We came to the end of our debates. Thank you very much for all patience and just give a quick look to what we like to portray to you today at Santa Sofia. A lot of things, a lot of history, a lot of religions altogether are still there. Thank you.